I'm so pleased and honored again to introduce these three speakers. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And Baki, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me try sharing my screen. Abby, can you see the full images?
Looks great, yes.
You don't see too many sidebar images, is that right?
Nope,
Fantastic.
just the slides.
Great. It's a real pleasure for me to be here in conversation with Annu Palakunnathu Matthew, whose work has been so deeply inspiring to my book, and with Jodi Throckmorton, whose curatorial ventures I've learned so much from. So thank you both so much. I'm really excited for our conversation today. I'm delighted to introduce my new book, Unseeing Empire, Photography, Representation, South Asian America. My book focuses on visual representations of South Asian Americans in order to think through what it means for immigrants of color to be represented. For racialized immigrants, including myself, we often understand our own desire for representation to emerge out of our invisibility in public culture, an absence that we think can be rectified with better or more visual representations of ourselves. But what if representation itself is a problem, particularly in photography, when the history of photography is a history of the documentation and surveillance of people of color? Some of the questions that I ask in this book include, what does it mean for immigrants of color to see themselves represented, particularly in photography? How do we establish relations of identity with the photographic object? And why do we feel so drawn to images that we think represent us? What might we do with visual artworks that repel us or that alienate us? In Unseeing Empire, I think through these questions in relation to photograph-based art by a variety of artists, including Annu Palakunnathu Matthew, as well as Gauri Gill and Seher Shah. I draw on methods that include ethnographic fieldwork at galleries and museums across South Asia and North America. And I also include archival readings and close readings of the artworks. What I try and argue across the book is that contemporary representations of racialized immigrants are haunted by histories of empire, including histories not of our own time, or empires not of our own time. For South Asian Americans and for immigrants of color more broadly, photography is in some ways the only material archive of our lives. We cannot find our histories recorded in national and public archives, and so we look to photographs to tell us who we are. I'm interested in why South Asian Americans look to photography as an archival record, how photography can refuse to show us the representations that we're looking for, and in what ways photography reshapes our sense of the time and space of immigration. Across the book, I'm interested in the kinds of histories that emerge out of the process of seeing photography. So that includes both the histories that are recorded within the visual image, as well as the kinds of historical narratives that viewers recall and remember when they look at the photograph and they claim it as a representation of themselves. So what I'll do today is share a chapter from Unseeing Empire that focuses on an extraordinary set of diptychs that Annu has created called An Indian from India. It's a series that Jodi has curated in her exhibitions. And I'm so thrilled. Can I say this, Jodi? I'm so thrilled that the work is now part of PAFA's permanent collection. So this is just a real moment for us. I'll talk about how An Indian from India works as a contemporary representation of South Asian immigration by binding together various histories of ethnographic photography from the late 19th through the early 21st century. I'll discuss how South Asian American viewers claim An Indian from India as a representation of our own migrations. But I'll also discuss how the display of this work at a major museum prompted me to think about what histories of empire are made visible in the museum and what histories are obscured and ignored. And I'll conclude by offering some ways of rethinking the relation between race and representation in contemporary fine art photography. In An Indian from India, the question of representation comes to the surface of the photographic print. In this series of diptychs produced between 1999 and 2007, Matthew takes images from Edward Curtis's 30-volume set, The North American Indian, among other photographic collections of Indigenous peoples, recreating the scene of Curtis's photograph with herself as the subject. faithfully adhering to the sepia-toned printing, lighting, and setting that characterizes Curtis's studio photography, Matthew's digital images reproduce the ethnographic forms and modes of display that characterize the North American Indian. Looking across the diptychs from left to right and back again, we see the precise alignment between the archival image and Matthew's duplication, how the torn and ripped edges that mark the archival image are reproduced in her self-portraits, and the ways in which she replicates the stances held by Native portrait subjects through her own body. Displayed and as framed prints and as orotones, the arresting difference that marks each diptych slowly comes into view. We notice how Matthew's captions rewrite Curtis's descriptions of his subjects, how in some images she incorporates subcontinental fabrics and jewelry in her clothing, and the ways in which she gently cradles a plastic Barbie doll in one image rather than a human baby. As Matthew duplicates early 20th century settler colonial portraits of Native peoples as a means to enact her own self-representation, an Indian from India makes visible the relations of power between the ethnographic subject and the aesthetic object, between acts of picture taking and picture making, and between Native peoples and South Asian immigrants who are both named Indians in these prints. Matthew notes in her artist statement that, and I'm quoting here, "In this portfolio, I play on these stereotypes using photographs of Native Americans from the 19th century. I pair these with contemporary images of myself in clothes, poses, and environments that mimic these older images. I am challenging the viewer's assumption of then and now, us and them, exotic and local." Reframing Curtis's photographic images in relation to her own visible presence in the United States, an Indian from India initially appears to displace Indigenous subjects in the Americas, to foreground instead the experience of South Asian American immigrants. I want to expand our understanding of these diptychs by considering another way of seeing, a way of stepping outside the framework of the diptych to complicate what we understand to be an American story, and to consider how multiple histories of colonialism and empire shape what we see. We know through the work of Indigenous curators, art historians, and Indigenous studies scholars that Curtis's portraits were staged to enact a seemingly timeless depiction of Indianness. Curtis and his peers often used the same people to pose in photographs meant to depict different Native nations. He borrowed confiscated regalia from museums and government archives to stage tableaus of battles and dances. We know that Curtis eliminated objects such as blue jeans and clocks from his photographic negatives in order to eliminate any trace of modernity. And we also know that he often used a large aperture to lend a soft romantic focus to several images. That is, Curtis's photographs produce precisely those Native figures that we want to see. So in this sense, the archival image betrays our desire for authentic representation. At work in the Settler Colonial Archive, Matthew creates diptychs that magnify her own racial subjugation as an immigrant through performative and citational practices that reinscribe technologies of documentation practiced by Curtis and his peers. In turn, the artwork that she produces intensifies the viewer's relation of identification with and estrangement from the image. We think we see on the right side of the diptych an Indian. But what we realize as we view Matthew's self-portraits in relation to the reproduced archival images on the left is the fact that these original photographs of Native subjects are also a performance. Looking at the diptychs from left to right and back again, what we realize is that photography cannot capture the truth of the Indian, whether Indigenous or immigrant. In Matthew's Navajo Smile, Malayali Smile, also known as Smiles, the left side of the diptych is an unpublished photograph from Curtis's archives titled A Navajo Smile, and that's from 1904. On the right side of the diptych is Matthew, who occupies the same frontal position as the subject in Curtis's print. The archival picture features an unnamed woman draped in a blanket, her body and her face turned towards the camera. Sunlight streams in from the left side of the picture frame, emphasizing the textures of the blanket, her skirt, and her thickly braided hair. On the right, we see Matthew's sari that tonally reflects the adjacent blanket, and she mimics the pose of the female subject, even though I think her expression is more quizzical. The female subject of the archival print, A Navajo Smile, in fact appears in two images later compiled in Curtis's The North American Indian, Navajo Woman and The Blanket Maker, both taken in 1904. And it's important to note that in all three images, the subject of this photograph remains unnamed. In Navajo Woman, the subject directly faces the viewer. With one eye slightly squinted, the left side profile of her face is cast in shadow. She wears a woven blanket, multiple necklaces, as well as an ornate belt, and we know from archival sources that her jewelry actually belonged to Curtis. And in The Blanket Maker, we see the same female subject covered in another blanket, holding a neatly bundled skein of yarn. Like the image used in Smiles, the archival photograph's beauty, that is, its aesthetic value, corresponds directly to its ethnographic value, as we perceive the authenticity of this image in the absence of a studio backdrop and what appears to be the female subject's smile. And yet, it's precisely through naturalizing this style of ethnographic photography that Curtis created the very indigenous subjects that he wanted to see. So instead of looking at the archival image and seeing a single authentic or stable ethnographic subject, what I see in An Indian from India is a doubling of Curtis's performance photography. Once these images are doubled, the subjects of the print are already in excess of the national, regional, and linguistic appellations that are given to them, such as Navajo or Malayali. Matthew's use of a sari here directly reflects Curtis's practice of using various costumes to identify his photographic subjects, as Yoruk, as Apache, and so on. So I'm going to turn to another image here. In Bells, also known as the Belle of the Yakimas and the Belle of the Deccan Plateau, Matthew pairs an archival image taken by Frank LaRoche, a contemporary of Edward Curtis, with another self-portrait. In both photographs, the portrait subject sits upright, and this is the kind of classic three-quarters pose of that you see in a lot of ethnographic photography. LaRoche's luminously lit studio portrait features an unnamed female subject whose ears, neck, and wrists are adorned with beaded and metal jewelry. Her waist is cinched with a woven belt. These material objects occupy an intimate relation to the body of the sitter. The silver jewelry touches her skin, her shoulders are covered with textured materials, and her hair is ornamentally displayed in two perfectly symmetrical braids. What makes this woman a belle from the Yakimas is precisely the profusion of jewelry and clothing that she wears, because there's nothing outside of the studio portrait to suggest the location of this photographic subject in the Yakama Nation, in what is now Washington State. Likewise, in her self-portrait, Matthew wears elaborate earrings, multiple necklaces, and ties a sash around her torso, which is encased by a printed cotton vest. Restraining her curly hair into two braids, Matthew looks discomfited by her identification as a belle. The Deccan Plateau of the title refers to the vast stretch of central and southern India that encompasses 8 states and several major cities, including one of Matthew's hometowns, Bangalore. But just as the sovereignty of the Yakama Nation is elided in LaRoche's photograph, the Deccan Plateau cannot encompass Matthew's diasporic locations in England, India, and the United States. Equally important, the jewelry and clothing that Matthew wears in this image is not native to the region. The sash, for example, is a bandhani print from Rajasthan in Western India. Matthew's use of a wide range of textiles and jewelry reflects back on the abundant use of accessories to identify the unnamed native subject as quote-unquote Yakima, and more broadly demonstrates how racial identity and gender themselves become objects of visual consumption. As the diptych shows us, it's through forms of bodily adornment that both photographic subjects are racialized as Indian and gendered female. The objects that Matthew uses to identify herself as a quote-unquote Indian, indeed the very idea that what it means to be Indian can be represented through material objects, are in fact central to the visual archive of another empire at another time. This is a history of 19th century ethnographic photography on the Indian subcontinent, images of indigenous subjects created by British colonial photographers. It's this genealogy of photographing the Indian that haunts my viewing of Matthew's diptychs. It's a mimetic connection between two imperial projects, US settler colonialism on native lands and British colonialism in South Asia, that flashes up at the interstices of an Indian from India. So I want us to conjure here another colonial archive, one that's not explicitly replicated in Matthew's diptychs, but that surfaces beneath her photographic reproductions as a remembered set of images that shapes my viewing of her artwork. The People of India is an 8-volume collection commissioned as a private memento for the first British Viceroy of India between 1868 and 1875. The People of India compiled images of, and I quote from the preface here, the more remarkable tribes to be found in India, in photographs that should be, and I quote, large enough to exhibit the chief physical peculiarities and the distinctive costume of each race. Across 480 images, the People of India created an encyclopedic rendition of caste, regional, religious, and linguistic groups on the subcontinent. Preceding the North American Indian by nearly 40 years, the photographs collected in the People of India are distinct in one key respect from the images later produced by Curtis. This imperial archive is not intent on capturing what Curtis described as a so-called vanishing Indian, but rather in documenting a colonized subject population that proliferates beyond the camera's eye. There are too many Indians to photograph, hence the need for a taxonomic compilation. But what aligns the People of India with the North American Indian is the fact that both collections secured the camera's claims to scientific truth, as well as a capacity of photography to produce and archive racial difference. There's no historical documentation that confirms whether Curtis was formally influenced by the People of India, although it's worth noting that these volumes actually traveled as far afield as Berlin, Melbourne, Toronto, New York, and Chicago. However, in recalling this other set of images, which you can now freely find on Google, there's plenty of these images that you can find online, I want to acknowledge how Curtis's obsessive need to photograph the Indian echoes throughout my viewing of the People of India. And likewise, I want to emphasize how colonial technologies of surveillance and documentation that shaped the People of India rippled through the North American Indian. In both, the imperial camera becomes a mode of ordering the world, the means through which historical knowledge is produced, disseminated, and consumed. It's the order that the camera imposes on its subjects that comes to appear as ethnographic fact and as aesthetic beauty. It's these beautiful images that become the photographic matter of the archive. And it's within these imperial archives that South Asian American viewers like myself look for traces of self-representation. I'm going to turn finally to a reading of an Indian from India that situates these diptychs within the context of museum exhibitions. In October of 2015, I went to see an amazing solo show of Matthew's work at the Royal Ontario Museum, the ROM in Toronto, Canada. Titled Generations, the exhibition curated by Dipali Divan showcased the importance of immigrant self-representation across multiple generations. It also demonstrated how, in Matthew's hands, a single photographic print can transmute into a fictional narrative, a historical document, and an aesthetic object. The ROM is Canada's largest museum of natural history and world cultures, and so it's an extraordinary site to display Matthew's artwork. The photographs, Generations, was displayed in a gallery steps away from the museum's collection of contemporary and ancient South Asian art, the Christopher Ondaatje Gallery, which is the image on the top left here. The South Asian Gallery, in turn, is 3 levels above the museum's main atrium, which is presided over by a life-size dinosaur skeleton. And that's the image on the top, right? And you can see the amazing facade of the ROM on the bottom image. At first glance, Generations appears to be wedged between 2 contradictory forms of display. On the one hand, an exhibition of evolutionary biology that befits a natural history museum, and on the other hand, a prominent South Asian art collection. But there's also a third form of exhibition at the ROM that's central to my reading of Matthew's work, and that's the Daphne Cockwell Gallery of Canada First Peoples Arts and Culture. The gallery, the Cockwell Gallery, is actually on the ground floor of the ROM, and there's free public access to it now. The Cockwell Gallery presents a collection of material objects crafted and curated by First Nations artists and art advisors, including wooden sleighs, birch bark canoes, sealskin Inuit coats, blankets, and spears. At the center of the gallery space are life-size dioramas that feature the museum's wax sculptures of Haudenosaunee men, refashioned with jeans, iPods, and camera tripods. So it's an attempt to restore those modern objects that are taken out of Curtis's photographic negatives. So what's really interesting to me and what troubles me is that the ROM's representation of Indigenous peoples as objects under ongoing conditions of settler colonial rule is integral to seeing generations, an exhibition that encourages immigrant self-representation. An Indian from India was displayed 3 floors above the Daphne Cockwell Gallery. For the first time, Matthew's diptychs were paired alongside original prints from Curtis's The North American Indian, a series that's also part of the ROM's permanent collection. At Generations, a glass vitrine contained 2 images from Curtis's The North American Indian, Cheyenne Girl, that's the image on the right, and 2 Moons Cheyenne, that's the image on the left. The first is from 1905 and the second is from 1910. Loosened from the archive, the large plate format emphasizes Curtis's extreme close-up of the Cheyenne elder, and in particular, the attention that Curtis pays to 2 Moons' headdress as a mark of social rank and nobility. Duplicated and retitled as Noble Savage in Matthew's diptychs Noble Savage, the image of 2 Moons Cheyenne is actually displayed twice more in the exhibition within multiple copies of Matthew's diptych that were on display. As I walked through the gallery space, I was overwhelmed by the experience of seeing 2 Moons Cheyenne on its own, as well as a reproduction within multiple renditions of Matthew's work. I had entered the ROM expecting to see my own identity as a South Asian immigrant mirrored in Matthew's installations within a major exhibition that was itself a celebration of South Asian immigrant representation. But what I experienced instead was a sense of disorientation, an inability to see the difference between the original archival print and its duplications, between Curtis's performance photography and Matthew's, between Matthew's self-representation and my claim to her image as a representation of myself. Despite my repeated efforts to walk across multiple galleries in order to tie together these disjointed forms of representation, what I came to experience was the fact that the ways that I see an Indian from India, the settler, colonial, and imperial archives that shape how I see an Indian from India were shut out of the viewing frame, and they remained firmly locked in other spaces of the museum, including the South Asian Gallery and the Cockwell Gallery. So I want to end by asking a couple of questions. What does it mean for immigrants of color to see ourselves in the photograph and to recall at the same time the memory of seeing ourselves in settler, colonial, and colonial ethnographic photography? How do we recognize ourselves as both the subjects of our own representation and as objects on view in imperial projects of representation? The fact that as South Asian American viewers, we may persist in seeing ourselves alongside the artist in this photographic series, as if we're also Indians, as if these archival images confirm our own authenticity, makes clear the legacy of images of empire. As I write throughout my book, empire comes to life not just in the photographic image, but also in the spaces of the museum, shaping our most public as well as our most intimate ways of seeing ourselves. For South Asian American viewers and artists, our insistent collective desire for representation is itself an effect of imperial archives, a haunted vision of seeing oneself. Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to have speak about any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Baki. That was incredible, and I can't and thank you, Annu, in advance for being here. I can't tell you what a joy it is to be in conversation with you all, because I feel like we get to do this occasionally privately, so it's nice to do so publicly. You know, I've admired Baki's scholarship and curatorial work since our early days in Philadelphia, and I do have a physical copy of the book, which is quite beautiful. Just arrived last week, so please, everyone, I can't recommend it highly enough. And of course, Annu, I've had the chance to curate in an exhibition I did, as well as I've acquired your work for 2 museums now, I believe, the Ulrich as well. So it's really wonderful to have you both here. And I want to kick off with a question for you both, and something that was, I'm not sure if surprise is the right word, but something that really grounded the book for me, Baki, and I think grounds your work for me as well, Annu, is the fact that you both use yourselves. So you not use yourselves, but there's a personal, it's rooted in you as the author, or you as the artist, right? It's very clear in Annu's work that she's performing in those photographs, but Baki, you also really root it about yourself. You know, you even say, what does it mean for people like me looking at this? So I'm wondering if you could talk more about the decision to really put yourself in the middle in that way.
Yeah, Annu, do you want to go ahead?
No, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jodi. I really appreciate that question, because this project, writing the book, turned into such a personal project for me. I think in some ways quite differently from my first book. I have lived in the United States on and off now, or mostly on, in fact, for over 20 years. And so part of the project of this book is trying to figure out, why am I so deeply invested in the idea of seeing myself, right? And I think one of the questions that drives this book is, why are South Asian immigrants, and I put myself in that, right? Why are South Asian immigrants looking all the time to see images of ourselves, as if the better or the more images that we see, the more we will finally see our lives represented. And one of the things that helped me to navigate this project is thinking about my own experience of all of these amazing artworks that Annu has produced, that Gauri and Sahir and other South Asian diasporic artists have produced. I realized that when I went to see their exhibitions, I always claimed their artwork as something that reflected me. Annu, if you don't mind, I want to talk about a work of art that I refer to in the book, but which I didn't speak about just now, which is Annu's installation, Fabricated Memories. And that's an installation which is a very personal installation, Annu, for you, right? It's a beautiful collection of photographs that Annu has created that are from your own family albums. I saw Annu's work, Fabricated Memories, in 2005 at the Queen's Museum in New York. And when I saw that artwork, at the time it was in an exhibition called Fatal Love, I didn't spend too much time looking at it. I saw it and I thought, oh, that's so beautiful, and saw the images of the child and the parents in Fabricated Memories. And I thought, oh, that looks just like Polaroid photos and family pictures that my family has stored. Annu and I both have curly hair, but our actual lives cannot be more different. But Annu was born in England, and you grew up in rural England until you were about 11, is that right?
Correct.
And I was born in Bombay, but I grew up in Tokyo. So we have very different paths of immigration. But then when I was standing in front of Fabricated Memories, I thought, oh, that's my life. You know, seeing those images captured something that was very personal to me. It wasn't until 10 years later in 2015, when I went to see Annu's show Generations, that I realized that Fabricated Memories is actually not a replica of Annu's family photographs, but something that she had digitally altered, right? I didn't realize that in that installation, Annu was not just talking about her family's immigration to England, but that in fact, that entire installation was a story about, Annu, if you don't mind me saying, like the loss of your father and your family's life thereafter. So it was an extraordinarily moving moment where I felt like I had seen a visual representation that captured who I was. But the closer I got to that image, the more I realized that that image is actually not about me. So this whole book, in a way, is trying to figure out, how do we come close to representations, visual representations that we think show us who we are? But how might those same representations, in fact, show us different histories or different narratives?
Well, and it occurred to me as I was reading the book that that's the other archive that's haunting these images, is the personal archive. And that comes from the author or the artist, or frankly, the viewer coming in with those personal memories. And Annu, I think that's something that you address in your work, really. There's that intersection of those three, the settler colonial, the imperial, and then this personal archive as well.
I mean, that's absolutely correct. I mean, I grew up in India, unlike Baki, and I think coming to the US, you become even more conscious of the influence of colonial, the colonial history that India has. And that really influenced my work. And to answer your earlier question, those of you who've seen some of my presentations know that I always start by saying that David likes to say that my work is all about me, me, me. But the truth is, as an artist, because a lot of these bodies of work take years to finish. So for me to really be invested in them, they usually start with my own experiences, but then I try to make them larger than just my own story. And I think Baki brought up Fabricated Memories, which is, I actually made that for myself for my family actually, on the 20th death anniversary of my father. And then as people started seeing it, the Jayashri Chandani included it in the Queen's Museum show, which is how Baki saw it. So it initially wasn't made for exhibition, but subsequently has been and has had a really kind of poignant reaction from people. A lot of tears.
Yeah, I have to say that was one of the early, I think I saw it at CPI actually, Essa, one of the early works by Annu that I experienced. And that was frankly a way for me to connect with the work as well. I found it incredibly moving. And one of the other things that we touch on, and that the three of us have talked about as well, and something that is something that I dwell on and think about quite a lot is we're talking about immigration to the United States. PAFA is an American art museum. It's a category of American that I'm uncomfortable with, frankly, right? So something that we've talked a lot about is when these works are acquired by museums, when these works are shown at museums, the context that takes on, and how what we may see and may come from a good place of saying that this is an American, or these are Americans, and that there's this intersection with these other histories. It's also an isolationist exercise in a way that cuts off the intersection with other histories, for example. So right, if I was thinking about showing Annu's work in context with, for example, our famous painting, William Penn's Treaty with the Indians, right, which is a painting that shows a very rosy picture of what William's Penn trade with the Lenape Indians was like. So I'm wondering if you all would comment on that, like, how you talk a lot about the different displays and modes of display and where things are, and how you've seen your work, Annu, for example, how you see your work in different ways in different institutions. You've also played a lot with the way that you install the work, whether that be a projection or in a book, a digital image in a book, or printed diptychs, that type of thing. How you've seen those modes of display affect the interpretation of the work, for example.
Baki?
Well, I'll take up the baton.
Okay.
Well, I think, Jodi, I think that's your own curatorial work at PAFA has been so instrumental, I think, in really opening up our ideas of what the museum can look like, and what kinds of narratives the museum can lend to the artwork on display. And just thinking, Annu, about your work in An Indian from India. I mean, so one of the things about An Indian from India is that it's circulated so widely, right? It's been featured in museums ranging from the Smithsonian to like BuzzFeed. So it's so widely accessible. One of the things I think is really interesting about seeing Annu's work is that in each context, the work acquires very different kinds of meaning. So just now I spoke about seeing an Indian from India at the ROM, which is a natural history museum. But of course, Generations was not meant to be a natural history exhibit. Generations is an exhibition of fine art and fine art photography. It just happened to be housed within this museum. Maybe I can speak about another context where I saw an Indian from India, which was at the Smithsonian exhibition Beyond Bollywood, Indian Americans Shape the Nation. And maybe some folks in the audience will be familiar with this. It was an exhibition at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in 2014, 2015. And Anu, one of the things that was so compelling about your artwork when it was on display at the Smithsonian in that show was that that entire exhibition was a narrative about South Asian American representation, right? So that exhibition was really a forum for so many people, not just South Asians, to come in and say, oh, look, South Asians belong in the United States. We belong here in the Smithsonian. Now we're seeing ourselves, our histories and our identities represented on these museum walls. And 4 diptychs from an Indian from India were part of that show. And I remember going multiple times to that exhibit and just sort of noticing how so many viewers, both South Asian and not, would stand in front of Anu's diptych and admire it and identify with it and comment on it. But it's also the case that that Smithsonian exhibit can't be divorced from the fact that within the permanent collection of the Natural History Museum are skulls of Native peoples, of incarcerated Native peoples, and plaster busts of incarcerated Native people. So when those objects are in your permanent collection, buried sort of in the vault, so to speak, right? Then they can't, those kinds of collections necessarily, I think, haunt our experience of seeing works like these. So I really think about Anu's work as pushing back and pushing against the ethnographic photography that Curtis is doing that work. But then in the context of his display, we're also remembering these other histories that are resurrected in the act of viewing.
So I'm going to indirectly answer your question because I think Baki brought up some threads that I think are interesting. First of all, Baki, thanks for reminding me that 2 of my most significant shows were at natural history museums. I think that brings up a question as to why, work by artists of color, that their significant shows are at a natural history museum. I mean, I think, unfortunately, it deflates my bubble a little bit, but I think it's an important point to think about. The other question I would pose is, you brought up the Smithsonian and what is in their collection. Do you think it's the artist's responsibility to react to that, or the curators? How should that be handled? Because it is, there is kind of a dichotomy there. So what is a responsible way to maybe handle that situation?
You're asking me?
Yeah. Because you've thought, as an artist, I don't think as much of the exhibition layout because I'm just so thrilled to have the show. Maybe maybe I should take more responsibility. But you've made me think more about, how shows are put side by side, what are in their collections. And I'm curious from your perspective, what are different ways that a museum can responsibly react to that?
Yeah, to be honest, I think it's your work as an artist is to create the things that we cannot create, right? Like I'm not an artist, so you're creating the work for us to see. And it is so thrilling to see your work in any number of contexts. But I think it's both the responsibility of the viewer and the responsibility of the curator to be aware of the histories of exhibitions in the spaces that we enter. Right? So we tend to think about the experience of seeing art as this entirely private thing. Like there's the image and then there's us. And the only relationship that matters is that one-to-one correspondence between the viewer and the artwork. But I think what I'm trying to say in this book is that there's a much larger social world that these artworks and that we as viewers are part of, right? When we enter into a museum, and I'm not the only person who has said this, but when we enter into a museum, we're bringing with us all these histories of who we are. And the museum itself has these imperial histories. And I think, Jodi, you can probably speak more to this than most, right? That there is the idea of a museum itself as an imperial construct. right? Now, all of us as artists, as curators, as critics and scholars, we're all trying to work to interrupt that imperial narrative, right? So I think that,
Absolutely.
your work is so central to that process. I think from my part, just, asking viewers um, to recognize the histories that they bring with themselves to the museum, and to be open to understanding that museums have different components. Like what I was trying to say with generations, right, is that you can go directly from the ROM's entrance to the third floor and see generations, but once you start walking around the ROM, then the meaning of the works and generations starts to shift and change.
Yeah, and I would
Jodi?
say
Oh,
it's
sorry.
oh, sorry. I would say it's certainly a curatorial responsibility. But one of the other things that we often talk about at PAFA is that it's an institutional responsibility too. Because when you're thinking about the decisions that are made, where to put this exhibition, where to put this one, et cetera, that all comes together in something that's an institutional responsibility. I will say that artists have more agency than ever, I think, to ask these questions of the curators they're working with and the institutions they're working with. Where is my work being shown? What's going to be next to it? All those context questions. And I think that they also have more agency and more power than ever to affect the way these decisions are made and what decisions are made about that. So, it's up to the individual artist, but I do think that most museums and curators are more open to listening and understanding and learning from those perspectives. But I think we all, good. Yep, Abby. I think we only have 10 minutes left, so I do want to let people ask some questions. I know it went very quickly. If anyone wants to put in the chat, or actually, Essa, I see you have a question. I'll unmute you. Go for it.
Actually, I was just writing you a private note. It's just a point of clarification because I've been working with Annu for over 20 years, and there are shows at natural history museums, but I would say absolutely that her work has been collected by art museums. And in fact, if you look at the Smithsonian, the exhibition might have been in the APA exhibition, but who owns the work is the Fair Sackler, which is the Asian Art Museum of the Smithsonian. And I also, the ROM, although it's a natural history museum, it's actually an encyclopedic kind of museum, in the sense that it's like the Met and the Natural History Museum put together. So what they're able to draw on is both Asia, as well as material from their collections, like the Curtis that they added to that exhibition. So I think that most people that are familiar with Annu's work are familiar with seeing it at an art museum.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Natural History Museum, to me, and I might be wrong, is an exception.
Well, and it's a good point to think that ROM is a natural history museum and an art museum, and we're talking about these intersecting histories and interdisciplinary things that come out in Annu's work. So that's certainly another way to think about it. That really brings those issues out. And thank you.
Yeah, I just also want to say I really appreciate. I think, Essa, from what I'm hearing from your comment also is like the enormous amounts of care that curators have shown, Annu, to your work, both at the ROM and Mosa Momaya at the Smithsonian and other folks there at the Smithsonian American Institute.
And there's another, I'm sorry and I didn't mean to interrupt, Baki, but I think it's also, speaking to your question, it's how the curators incorporate that material. And Jodi's a perfect example because, they look at this material and they're rethinking it now. Mm-hmm. I think 20 years ago, it might have been like, we're missing material from this region, so we need to add. But now they're really looking, and it's about the curators. It's about who's making those decisions. But I think that Annu would agree, the last few years, in the way that the work has been seen and paired with Boston Museum of Fine Arts is a great example. There was an exhibition on family, and Annu's work was actually projected in that, not as an object, but as a projection. So I think that it's really, hopefully, the changes within the museums and the curators being able to think more broadly about the material they're working with.
Absolutely.
You know, I would say the same about the Pali Divan, where each section of the exhibition was really thoughtfully kind of put together as a sensory experience. There was music, there was smell, audio, there was smell. So, I mean, I've really enjoyed those kinds of collaborative ways of showing the work.
Mhm.
And Annu, I did have a private chat, someone asking, what is Annu doing next?
Usually that's the worst question you can ask an artist, but actually I have an answer. So I just spent 6 months on a Fulbright fellowship in India, collecting photographs from the family albums of the 2.5 million Indians who fought in World War II, but are not recognized in history. And so I'm going to, as an artist, I can try and make that history more well-known and the stories accompanying those. And I just happen to have, I don't know if you can see this, it's a crystal, a 3-dimensional crystal of the family photographs that I'm going to be projecting archival footage through. And I'm also having a solo exhibition at the Newport Art Museum, which opens in September 2021, where this work will be shown for the first time. But don't ask me after that what I'm going to be working on.
Well, I'm sure you'll have something. I've never known you not to have an enormous project going on. So,
Yeah.
and then I also got the same question for Baki. What are you doing next, Baki?
Oh, well, that's a good question. It's actually something I've not shared with that many people, but now that there's like 100 people here, maybe it's a time for me to share it. I've actually been so, I know this is something I haven't told you either. Seeing Fabricated Memories and seeing those family photographs that you worked with there was so deeply moving to me. And it made me think about how, as some of you know, my family lived in Japan for 35 years. My parents moved there in 1976 and they lived there until 2010. And the only archive of our life from that time is in a collection of 100 family photograph albums. And so what I am planning to move to next is a series of essays that are about this collection of family albums. And it's an attempt for me to think through what it means to identify with these photographs of my family's life. There's no other trace of my family's experience as Indians in Japan. There's no government archives, there's no public records, there's novels, there's nothing. And so I think I'm going to, I'm not an artist, so I can't make fabricated memories, but I am a writer. And so I'm going to turn to this set of family albums and try and narrate the experience of creating a sense of self and community and belonging, not just for myself, but for the immediate members of my family. So I'm going to start working on that, hopefully when I go on sabbatical next year. Yeah.
And hopefully we can all actually, go ahead.
Sorry, Jodi, I was going to say I have family members on this call and they don't know I'm working on this. So on this call, well, that's what I'll be working on, and I'll be doing some oral histories with family as well.
That's great. And hopefully we will all actually be able to celebrate that publication in person instead of on Zoom.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions for Annu or Baki? Trying to see if anyone's waving their hands at me.
I was wondering, I know we were talking about the future, but just to backtrack a little bit, if Annu, if you felt comfortable talking about some of the genesis of the an India from India, I don't know where my language skills are today, but what I don't know what it felt like to start on that project or what drew you to that work. I'd love to hear a little more of that context.
Well, as Baki mentioned, I was born in England before I moved to India and then came here. And so I've got this strange accent that no one can really pinpoint where am I really from. So, when I first moved to Rhode Island, I couldn't understand them and they couldn't understand me. But when they would ask me where I'm from, if I said I was an Indian, I would often have to clarify that I'm an Indian from India because of the confusion of Christopher Columbus getting lost and finding North America and naming the people here as Indians. And so that's where the seed came from. And then I started doing a lot of research on the photographs. And at the same time, I was reading a book by Christopher Pinney. And I'm blanking on the name, Baki, you can
Camera.
remind me. Yeah, Camera Indica. And, you know, the two histories just overlap. There's so many similarities in the histories of photography and the colonial approach, both in India and the US. And so to me, I'm metaphorically joining hands with the Native Americans to reverse that gaze, to make the viewer question some of their assumptions.
And in the process, I know you're also alerting us to these histories of empire that precede Curtis, right? It's kind of like this artwork. Seeing an Indian from India helps us to telescope much further back. And I find that to be, I find the act of seeing that work to be so empowering on so many levels. So thank you for making it.
Thank you for writing about it.
Oh my gosh, it's really, I mean,
Yes. Thank you both for being here. It has been so wonderful, so wonderful. And please, I'll put in one last plug for this beautiful book that feels very lovely in its physical objectness. But please find the link in the chat and you'll enjoy reading it.
Yeah, Baki, unfortunately, I haven't received my copy to hold it up.
I know,
yet,
but you know
so-
what?
Oh,
I've just got 10 copies. I'm going to mail one today. So you'll get it soon. And Essa, to you too. Thank you, everyone.
yeah, thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Baki and Jodi. And Abby.
Oh, of course. Yeah, thank you all. And I dropped a link again and a lovely discount code provided by Duke University Press. So support them, support Baki. And again, a huge thank you to everyone for being here. I'd love just before folks leave, if you feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye. We'd love to hear from you. I know we're all apart physically, but it's so great to gather together for this community today. So again, stay safe, everybody, and feel free to say goodbye on your way out. But huge
Thank you. Goodbye. Fabulous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really wonderful.
Bye.
Great.
Okay, I wish we could
Yes.
clink a glass of
know.
champagne.
I should send across
Cheers.
something along with the book. So thank you so much, everyone.
Congratulations, Baki and everyone. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bakirati.
Bye. See you.
Bye, Anita. See you. So good
So
to
good
see
to see you.
So lovely. Yeah, we had over 100 folks. I think it was 104 tuned in.
Great.
So
That's wonderful.
That's great.
Yeah, you told us 50, so that's great.
I like to lower expectations and then
And then greatly exceed.
And thank you, Annu's mother, for listening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. Thank
Oh.
you very much. Mm.
We're so inspired by her artwork.
I don't know where she inherited it from, but anyway, I'm glad she brought it.
And I think my mother is also still on this call. So thank you, Mommy. I hope you could hear us.
I don't see her now.
Now it's there's a user money, which I think
Oh,
is
okay. Okay.
Ah,
You should be very proud of your daughter, Baki's mom.
I love the family affair and all the support of women on this call. It's really
oh, look, it's Buddy. Thanks, Buddy.
It was amazing. I mean, it reminded me of all of our conversations about so many things, but it's just it's so compelling. It's incredible.
It's great to see you.
Me too.
And as predicted, the trash came, but perfectly on time after our talk.
oh, good.